Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Knight. I'm the Associate Director of Practice at the Center for Collaborative Conservation at CSU. It's great to see you all together here this afternoon for this collaborative conversation. These are happy hour conversations. Drew didn't get that message. Sorry about that, Drew. All the rest of us are going to be happy this hour. But these conversations are co-hosted by the Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Western Collaborative Conservation Network. Just a quick note about these conversations. These started during COVID and have progressed from there. And it's really about creating a space for conservation practitioners to connect to each other, both on a personal and a professional basis, and to also sharpen our collaboration skills at the same time and to learn together and problem solve with our peers. The way these are structured, we usually start with a quick, short icebreaker of some kind related to the topic to get our ideas going and sharing. And then we usually have a facilitated discussion hosted on a particular topic that's been proposed by conservation practitioners. So as I said earlier, welcome to today's topic, Connecting Collaboration, Wellbeing, and Social Science. It's fun to be around some social scientists. I hope you feel excited about that as I do. Emily Jane Davis is with us and is our speaker and leading us through the main part of today. And I'll introduce Emily Jane in a few minutes. And we also have Drew Bennett from the University of Wyoming and also Katie Wolstein from University of Oregon as well. So they're going to help us with the breakout sessions as additional resources. So let's start with our quick icebreaker. And Emily Jane and I talked about a question that we could pose to all of you, and your answers will help give us some idea of where you're at in working with social scientists, but we'll also use them in the discussion section as well. So in the chat, consider this question, and I'll type it in here in a moment. So how has or how could social science help you in your collaborative conservation work? So let me now introduce Emily Jane. She just got back off an hour ago off a red-eye flight. Oh gosh, that's commitment for you. Thank you so much, Emily Jane, for being here today. But Emily Jane is she's got multiple roles, of course. Assistant professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society, and also an extension specialist in the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program at Oregon State University. She's also an associate director of the Ecosystem Workforce Program. If you haven't heard about that, I encourage you to learn more about that with the University of Oregon. And for those of you from CSU who remember and know Heidi Huber Sturms, you know her connection to that program as well. So Emily Jane does research and technical assistance focused on collaborative natural resource management, policy, and practice. So she works a lot with collaborative groups, understanding the practice of collaborative conservation and how you can use social science and think about well-being as part of that work. And in the poster promoting this, I hope you would have seen the working paper, which I saw and prompted me to contact Emily Jane. And then also 2 fact sheets that she shared as well. And those are still posted on our website. So Emily Jane, thank you again so much, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Heather. I'm happy to be here today. And I just want to start by acknowledging I'm going to speak for 10 minutes or less because I know this is kind of a peer learning and dialogue opportunity. So this won't be a lengthy PowerPoint, I hope. And I also want to start by acknowledging my partner, Brenda Smith, who's also on this call. She's the director of an organization called the High Desert Partnership, which is based in Southeastern Oregon. And Brenda, other staff, board members, and collaborative group members in that area that the High Desert Partnership supports. And I have been talking for a few years about how might they use social science more in their work, and in particular, how might it connect to well-being. which is one of the goals of High Desert Partnership. And so I just want to credit Brenda, her staff, and board with inspiring this work. What I'll be talking about today is pretty high overview or distillation, but I just want to acknowledge that that working paper and those briefing papers or fact sheets that Heather mentioned are a good way to look more at how we talked about how social science might fit in the context of all the collaborative groups they support, because they act as a backbone for several different collaborative groups. First, it sounds like you're all quite experienced with social science, which makes me really happy. But I always think it's interesting because it's about two different types of processes. Collaborative processes that I'm familiar with, a lot of them really strive to be science-based in general and to incorporate science along with values as part of decision making. But the scientific process and the collaborative process have some differences in terms of what they're trying to do, the steps that they take. So how do we bridge those two kinds of processes? How do we, in particular at the different steps of a collaborative process, depending on how your group or your process is working, how would you bring in social science? This is a question I have gotten asked a lot in my career, or not even in a collaborative setting, but just how do you bring in social science into natural resource management in general? And I have found that, like all of you are doing, there are a few different ways this happens in a collaborative setting in particular. Joint fact finding, so trying to explore existing knowledge. And this is science, I'm referring here to science in general, not just social science, but you may want to explore existing knowledge about a topic and understand what's out there, and all take a role in bringing that information to bear on something you're grappling with in your group or your process. Some groups work with scientists to produce original research. So in a biophysical science context, something like, we're unsure of the fire history, the fire history of this area, and we want to use that to inform what we might do as a group. And then quite a few folks are involved in monitoring, so repeated measurement and analysis to evaluate changes relative to something you or an agency you work with might be implementing. So those are applications of social science or science in general that I know many groups and processes already use. But I wanted to walk really briefly through a couple kind of like stereotypical things that have been said to me over the years. And this is not to be negative or to make fun of anyone who might have said these things before, but I've heard these all. And I think that it's great to use them as a starting point to dismantle assumptions about what social science is and how it can intersect with a collaborative process. So I've been told a lot that it's a soft science. It just consists of people's opinions or anecdotes. That's what social science is. I hear that a lot. So in order to address that, I like to think about how there's two parts to that term. There's social and there's science, and really break those two down, right? So science, regardless of what it's about, is knowledge that has been gathered using the scientific method, and that's been analyzed and organized systematically, potentially to try to prove or examine a theory or to produce new information about something. So that's science. And then social is referring to people, organizations, social systems, so different kinds of social units, and then how all of those might act as well. And many of you provided examples of how you're studying this already or using this in your settings. So when you put those together, it's knowledge about social dimensions, about social units, that has been gathered and organized in a systematic way to produce knowledge. I mean, I know that sounds really elementary, but sometimes I try to step back with that and say, this is a science. That's the basis of it. So it's not just anecdotes or personal experiences if those haven't been collected systematically, and if there haven't been standards for validity or rigor that have been applied. And regardless of if we are doing quantitative research and we're crunching numbers, or we're doing qualitative research, we're doing focus groups, interviewing folks, there are accepted practices to ensure the highest quality of doing this. So. Of course, it does differ from natural science, and there's a great online handbook about social science research that has it has some dense passages, but I do recommend folks look at it. There's just inherent variability, right, in the social phenomena we're trying to measure. So they can be less unambiguous. The conclusions that we draw as social scientists can be a lot more, it depends, that kind of thing. And we also are often dealing with unmeasurable phenomena that can't be quantified, but they can still be understood in a reasonable way. All right, this is another one I hear a lot, and maybe I'm sensitive to it because I do surveys, but I tend to do more interview-based research. So we need to do a survey. That's what social science is, surveys. Okay, well, we actually have a ton of tools in our toolbox as social scientists. These are some of them. And it sounds like you're all familiar with working with different, with some of these. The key really is to match the tool to your question and how you hope to use the information. So there are lots of situations when a survey might be what you need, and there's others where other approaches might be much more what you need. So for example, if you have a really clearly defined population that you're hoping to understand something from, and it's large enough that statistical analysis will be helpful to you, and you can use close-ended questions that can be answered in a more simple way, and you know that quantifying what you're trying to understand will have value, then that's great. But if you're not sure of that population, if you want to understand something really complex and ask questions in particular that are complex or might have multiple parts to them, and particularly if you're trying to not only gather information, but also build relationships, just dropping a survey on people isn't really always the appropriate way to do that. As many of you know, inherently, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. And then this is probably the main one I have because I work as an extension specialist trying to help people practice collaboration, and I'm also a social scientist, is the assumption that if we just have some social science, it will fix these people problems. People are upset about something, so let's do some social science and that will address it. Or even we're having an issue within our group or our stakeholder community. We need to use science to help with that. And that may sometimes be the case. You know, as many of you noted in your responses to the icebreaker, social science really can help understand that connection between, you know, what values do people hold and how are natural resources connected to those values and why. It can actually help get down at things that are under the surface, right? People might be saying something, or there may be a certain kind of visible behavior, but what are those invisible social values or social phenomena that are occurring? That's really, it can help you get at that. And it can help you identify some of the potential outcomes or trade-offs of management actions that you might be planning to take. But at the same time, social science takes time. So rarely is someone ready to spring into action to address your pressing problem. We often have to do things like go through human subjects review boards in order to get approval to talk to real live people. We have to go through different things at our institutions. So sometimes it's not the best way to deal with a pressing issue as well, just from almost a logistical point of view. I also like to point out that it's not the same thing as facilitation or mediation, outreach or communications as well, even though there are social science theories and there's empirical social science work that underpins the practice of facilitation or the practice of communications. It's not the same as maybe we actually just need a new communication strategy, or maybe we need to change how we're facilitating this process. And I think that's really important to recognize. Social science can inform those, but isn't necessarily the same as those things. The last one is, I know a social scientist who can help us. On one hand, it's extremely flattering when I get contacted about a whole variety of social issues and social topics out there. You sort of feel like I'm a hero. People would like to draw on my expertise, but at the same time, you feel deeply concerned because this isn't what you study, or the problem or opportunity that's being discussed is one that's probably best understood through a different method than you are experienced with. And the key about social scientists is, even though we are all very cool, if you know one, you don't know them all. So there's quite a few different disciplines in social science, and we can't even agree on what all the disciplines that belong or don't belong in social science are. So other social scientists might contest this, but so each of these different disciplines, for example, has a different set of traditions, and there can even be a lot of controversy within each of these disciplines about what the best approaches are or where this discipline is at. I actually am a human geographer. My degrees are in geography. And then finally, there's sort of the personal and institutional context of, I know a social scientist, maybe they can help us. Sometimes they're really well suited to, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes that comes down to just their personality and their ability to work in the complex space of a collaborative setting, because it can, as you know, it can be complex and it can be really challenging. Social scientists are found at all different kinds of places. So some of us are at universities, some of us work for government agencies, or even at nonprofits, or are going it alone as kind of a consultant model. We all have different position duties, and those may include different proportions of research, of teaching undergraduate, mentoring graduates, doing extension work like Katie and I, and sounds like Erin does, or just doing analysis, which is intended to gather information that people can use and not necessarily to produce new knowledge in the pursuit of a theory or a research question. And then we all have different funding models. So some of us are fully funded tenure track, others are grant funded, others might be doing more fee for service. So the point is we each come from different requirements and incentive structures. Some of us are desperately trying to do things like get tenure. Others are just trying to really make our work matter on the ground. And not that those two things can't coexist, but we just are all motivated by different things and are facing different pressures as well. So that's always something to take into account, and something to ask, your social scientist who you think you might want to work with. Some of these things just so you better understand, are they equipped to help you or not? Will this meet their needs as well? So I think I've gone on talking at you enough. I'll wrap up here. I know Heather has a few questions. She's going to pop them in the chat. I think that two of them that we're going to use to discuss are building on those experiences that you brought up in the chat during the icebreaker about how you've engaged social science. And then maybe, what do you think you need to take the next step? It sounds like a lot of you have some experience, but what do you need to really elevate how you're able to use it in your work and feel like you're getting value out of it?
Okay, so the two questions: what are your experiences with engaging with social science, and what do you need for taking the next step in engaging social science? Okay, so there's 4 people in each of the breakout rooms, and I'm gonna send you over there right now. I'm sure this will be a great conversation. That time goes way too fast. I hope it was great conversations. I popped in and out of each of your groups, and sounds like you had a lot to share. So Emily Jane, do you want to follow up with all the groups?
Sure. You want me to share what we talked about in our group? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
My group was Diane and Emery, and we talked about a few different things in both of their work. We talked about how social science can inform how we communicate about technical information. So how much information, how it's messaged, why would you include or not include all this detail about different engineering things. We talked about centering social scientists by having them actually on a project team, and examples of how that's done, and particularly bringing that expertise in early, not in a tokenistic way at the end. We talked some about the value, how social science can help. Diane provided an example of how a social scientist helped her and other engineers understand the value of water resources in a really different way than they were thinking about it in their engineering way, by looking at the value of recreation to people and the value of water, water quality to recreation folks. And we talked a bit about how there are some, the people side of things is often what the challenge is. So there may be some, technically a project might be really sound, but the social aspects around it are why it may be struggling. So the need to really just grounding in that need for social science as well. And Emery shared some good lessons learned about, again, wanting to, if you're going to try to gather information systematically, wanting to bring in social science design principles from the beginning. So you have built that in and have that kind of rigor. Emery or Diane, I don't know if you want to add anything, but that was kind of what we went over. Great. I think Heather disappeared, but she said she might. So I'll turn it over to Katie, who I think was one of the other group leaders, and then Drew after that, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, EJ. I was in a group with Aaron, Nicole, and Katie, and it actually seemed like everyone had a little bit in common in our little group. Everyone has worked to an extent with collaborative, and so that was kind of a uniting theme. And so part of our conversation included there isn't agreement about what social science is, either within the collaborative or even with, our community, our broader community with other kinds of scientists. And so that's, something that's a barrier to everyone understanding how social science can be useful. The other theme that emerged, and I think this was Aaron that brought this up really thoughtfully. Within a collaborative, you have, human relationships, histories, trust. It moves at pretty different speeds than things like management, implementation, and activities. And so there's this constant tension between like, well, do you undertake a project to build those relationships and trust, or do you need to have those relationships and trust to implement those projects? And most of us sat there scratching our heads and saying, yes, this is hard and we don't know. I see Brenda nodding her head, yes. And then there's also like this pitfall of assumptions within these collaborative groups and also within the scientific community. Like, do we know what the underlying social barriers or beliefs that prop up kind of or inform, management actions undertaken or positions that people are taking within these collaborative groups. And so there seemed to be agreement within our group that understanding those is important, especially in that collaborative setting. One important point that emerged also in our group was the nice part about undertaking social science is you can build relationships through data collection, and that's in stark contrast to I apologize. I think it was Aaron who said this, like, if you're going to go, follow a bird around, you don't need necessarily those social relationships to do that. And then, similar to what EJ said, you need funding and time to do rigorous research. And so that was identified as a barrier to folks in our group enhancing their engagement with social science. So thanks, everyone.
I can jump in with my group now. Yeah, thanks. So my group was John, Susan, and Brenda, and we all had, some different experiences using social science. Susan, in her work on policy and consulting work, has used different types of secondary data sets that are publicly available, which I think is an interesting tactic to make those data accessible to anybody that wants to be able to use them. Brenda got involved with some social science work through EJ and others, really trying to understand how community well-being fits into resource management and trying to make that linkage more explicit between how resources are managed and how they benefit community well-being. And for Brenda, it was really helpful and I think this is shared among us all, that bringing social scientists in to really just try to understand and unpack what do we even mean by terms like community well-being. And everybody thinks they have kind of an idea about what that is, but that's maybe not. Everybody has their own take on it and nuances around that. And so social science can help make that a little bit more transparent and where people are at. And hopefully, through a collaborative process might be able to bring people together to understand that a little bit better. John related an experience that I think has been shared with by many probably. He worked for the Nature Conservancy in Colorado as an ecologist and led the science team there, and talked about how they utterly failed to integrate social science into some of their work and trying to understand. He's perplexed by why they failed to do that and struggled with it. And in part, maybe it was because ecologists that don't have that training were somewhat tasked with trying to grapple with social science issues and probably just coming at it in a very different way. So I think that, like some of the other examples that were provided by the other groups, some of these barriers, for John, I think for others of trying to make to take social science to really integrate it. Sometimes there's these institutional barriers. So with TNC, not a signal from leadership that this was really important and was going to be resourced adequately to do it. So I think that's a barrier. And then I think there's also sort of a culture maybe in different work trying to sort of tack on social science at the end, or as research proposals are developed, social science are sometimes the last ones to be brought in. And I think many of us that do social science work have had that experience, and it's been frustrating. So I don't know if anybody else, Brenda, Susan, or John, would like to add on to that summary.
Thank you, Katie and Drew. Heather, I don't know if you're able to, it looks like you're there, but I'm not sure if you're able to speak. There you are, great.
So sorry, I had a cyberspace glitch for a moment there. But I had my phone ready, so I was listening and trying to dial back in, connect back in. But it sounds like so great conversations. Emily Jane, do you have some final thoughts for all of us to consider as we're going forward, thinking about social science and collaborative conservation, and advice to all of us as we think about engaging more with social science and well-being in our collaborative work?
That's a tall order, because I think there's been so much good said already here. I guess I'm struck by, on one hand, how diverse the experiences with social science seem to have been in this group. So different kinds of needs for social science, different kinds of social scientists engaged with. I think Diane said in our group that it's just a lot. There's a lot of potential there, and it varies a lot. But then at the same time, I see some common themes here, maybe about practical or structural barriers in working together more with social scientists. And I think those mirror the bigger barriers we see in, why isn't science used more in policy, right? Why isn't science used more in decision making in general? It seems like these line up well with bigger barriers and opportunities to do that. So yeah, I think those would be my last thoughts, and I would be curious to see if anyone else has any takeaway reflections like that too.
Yeah, any other overarching reflections here? I'm thinking back to my work with the Nature Conservancy in this watershed, and we struggled early on to bring in social scientists as soon as we could. And one of our challenges was, at the time, our community was changing so rapidly. There was so much pressure and change, and everybody was just focused on the doing of conservation on the ground, and we didn't feel like we had time to step back and reflect and kind of understand the dynamics in the community and really have time. And I think you mentioned this earlier, EJ, about having the time to sometimes gather the information that you need. So I really, since then, have really encouraged people to early on, seek social scientists and economists wholeheartedly, as well as ecologists, when they do this work, and maybe even earlier, because we all have, as you said, barriers, but we also have learning ourselves to figure out how to really utilize those people and those resources as well. Well, I'll wrap us up. I think we could probably go on into many more dimensions here, but I'm glad that we had this opportunity to start this conversation and connect with you, Emily Jane. Very much appreciated your work. I hope we'll continue to track it and call upon you and learn from you. I'm sure we will. And Drew and Katie, also great to have you help today too. Two more great social scientists in our region. And Brenda, we know you as a resource also now. So thank you all for being willing to help us through this conversation today, to hear each other and to learn together.